My name is Bill Herbert, and it is my honor and privilege to be a distinguished lecturer at Hunter College and the National Center's executive director. Thank you for joining us for this session about Jerry Beyer's new book, Just Universities, Catholic Social Teaching Confronts Corporatized Higher Education. It's a wonderful book that we encourage you to consider purchasing. The two sessions today are part of the National Center's annual conference, which began on Monday. And we are grateful to Roosevelt House and Commonweal Magazine for co-sponsoring both panels this morning. I want to thank my good friend and colleague, Harold Holzer, for the continued collaboration between Roosevelt House and the National Center, as well as Harold's extraordinary leadership at Roosevelt House. We look forward to resuming in-person public policy discussions at Roosevelt House sometime soon. The National Center is a labor management research center, and for almost 50 years, we've organized national and regional conferences, as well as conducted original research into collective bargaining and unionization in higher education. The subjects of Joe Biden and Catholicism in higher education are directly related to the National Center's mission, as well as this year's conference theme, higher education, collective bargaining, and the Biden administration. During his campaign, Joe Biden made clear, and since he assumed the office, Joe Biden has made clear his intent to be the most pro-labor president since FDR. In late February, President Biden gave an extraordinary address via Twitter, affirming his administration's unequivocal support for union organizing and collective bargaining, and emphasizing an important fact frequently forgotten. Federal law states that it is the policy of the United States to encourage unionization and collective bargaining. That public policy statement remains in the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, one of the many labor reforms enacted during the New Deal. Faculty unionization issues at Catholic institutions is an important part of the National Center's research and programming. In 2015, our conference included a panel titled Catholic Colleges and Universities, Collective Bargaining and the NLRB, which was moderated by the late scholar David Gregory, a law professor at St. John's Law School. During this year's conference, we have already had panels that examine practical and legal issues surrounding the unionization of adjunct faculty at Catholic institutions. Faculty, graduate assistants, and staff at Catholic-affiliated institutions have a long history of union organizing. In the past decade, the vast majority of organizing efforts have been among low-wage adjunct faculty who understand unionization as being a primary and most effective means to obtain a livable wage, to obtain dignity in the workplace, and as a means to participate in institutional affairs. A National Center study issued last November found that close to 17% of all new private sector adjunct faculty bargaining units in the United States between 2013 and 2019 were at religiously affiliated institutions. During the same period, however, other Catholic affiliated institutions have been using the First Amendment as a union avoidance strategy, arguing that the Constitution prohibits the NLRB from asserting jurisdiction over their schools. Over the past 5 months, in fact, there have been 3 federal court decisions sustaining objections by Catholic affiliated institutions to federal regulation, arguing based on the First Amendment. Recently, 2 other institutions unilaterally ended decades-long relationships with their faculty unions. As Jerry Beyer explains in his new book, Catholic Social Teaching, Support for the Rights of Workers to Form Unions is not being practiced by many Catholic colleges and universities. The current split among Catholic institutions towards unionization reflects the divisions and tensions over Catholic social teachings today in the United States, as was discussed earlier during our first panel. Holding these 2 conference sessions on Joe Biden, Catholicism, and Catholic higher education at Roosevelt House is appropriate in light of Biden's efforts to emulate FDR when it comes to labor rights. It is also appropriate because of a Hunter College graduate named Bella. The Bella I'm referring to is not Bella Abzug, one of Hunter College's most illustrious graduates, a legendary congresswoman who Harold Holzer worked for many years ago. No, I'm referring to a second Bella in Hunter College's history. Her name was Bella Dodd. After graduating from Hunter in 1925, she went on to become a Hunter instructor in political science and economics for close to a decade. During her time on faculty, she helped to organize the Hunter College Instructors Union. That early organization of adjunct faculty advocated for job security and better pay for Hunter College's instructors and tutors. Later, Dodd became an attorney and chief lobbyist for the College Teachers Union, which was discussed in a session during on Tuesday during the conference with respect to that union's social unionism. But Bella Dodd successfully argued on behalf of that union in Albany in the late 1930s for a passage of a tenure statute. Dodd was also instrumental in the affiliation of that faculty union with the CIO's, State County Municipal Workers of America, which went on to negotiate the first faculty contracts in the United States in higher education. But Dodd is probably best known in history for something else. After she later returned to Catholicism, she began to denounce her earlier radical politics. In the 1950s, she turned into a friendly witness who named names before UAC and the McCarran Committee, making McCarthyite allegations of communist infiltration of labor and even the Catholic Church. Bella Dodd's extreme shift in her journey predated the changes in viewpoint by people like Michael Dovak and Father Newhouse, mentioned by E.J. Dionne and Heidi. Those unsubstantiated assertions by Dodd concerning the Catholic Church continue to be referenced 60 years later by critics of the progressive wing of Catholicism. On a certain level, Dodd's faculty union activism and her later trajectory into an anti-leftist crusader connects the two panels this morning. It's now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Donna Haverty-Stack, who will be moderating the second panel. Donna is a professor of history at Hunter College and the Graduate Center at CUNY, where she teaches courses in U.S. cultural, urban, labor, and legal history. Donna is the author of The Fierce Life of Grace Holmes Carlson, Catholic Socialist Feminist, which was published last year by NYU Press, as well as Trotskyists on Trial, Free Speech and Political Persecution Since the Age of FDR, which was published in 2015. Donna?
Thank you, Bill. Thanks so much for that great introduction to the panel. I'm just going to take 2 minutes to quickly lay out the format of our panel today and introduce our wonderful speakers. We're going to follow pretty much a roundtable format. Jerry's going to talk first for about 10 minutes about his wonderful book, which is the focus of our panel today. And then each of the discussants will talk for about 10 minutes about their respective experiences with Catholic social teaching and Catholic higher education. And after that, Jerry and the discussions will engage in an open conversation where they can respond to each other's comments. And then Mac Barrett, our Roosevelt House coordinator, will open up the floor to your questions. So please post any questions you have for any of the speakers at any time during the presentations in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Mac will get to as many of them as possible during that part of our program. We have a wonderful panel of speakers today. Jerry Beier is an associate professor of Christian ethics at Villanova University. He is the author of Just Universities, Catholic Social Teaching Confronts Corporatized Higher Education, which is the focus of this panel. An expert in the field of Christian ethics, Dr. Beier is also the author of Recovering Solidarity, Lessons from Poland's Unfinished Revolution, and he is associate editor of Horizons, the journal of the College Theology Society. Our second speaker is Patricia McGuire, and she has been the president of Trinity Washington University since 1989. Previously, she was the assistant dean for development and external affairs at Georgetown University Law Center, where she was also an adjunct professor of law. Dr. Mary Antoinette Smith is our third speaker today. She's a professor of English at Seattle University. Her areas of specialization are 18th and 19th century British literature, and she also teaches courses in African American literature, intercultural intersectional literature, and engaged gazing for social justice. Dr. Smith's pedagogy and scholarship promote praxis-centered race, class, and gender sexuality theory. Her current scholarly book project is titled Her Fierce Faith, Introducing Ellen Terry, African American Catholic convert and trailblazer of pre-civil rights interracial justice in the tradition of Catholic social action. And our final speaker for today is Lily Ryan, who works on organizing, research, and communications at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor at Georgetown University, with special attention to the Bargaining for the Common Good project. Lily graduated from Georgetown University in 2018, where she was a student activist organizing with campus workers and on international solidarity campaigns with the USAS network. So without further ado, I'll hand things off to Jerry to begin our program.
Thank you so much, Donna. Good morning to everyone. Thanks to everyone for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate in this discussion today. I'm especially grateful to the esteemed panelists, Lily Ryan, President McGuire, Professor Smith, and Professor Haverty Stack for their willingness to dialogue this morning about important issues in Catholic higher education. I'm also greatly indebted to Bill Herbert for suggesting and organizing this panel, and to the staff at the National Center for Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions and Roosevelt House for making it possible. I'll be brief this morning in presenting some of the main arguments from my recently published book. This panel is designed to be a conversation, not a book talk. We have, as you know, a stellar group of panelists who have a great deal of wisdom and expertise regarding Catholic higher education. So I'm honored and eager to learn from them this morning. In fact, as I say in my introduction to the book, its purpose is really to be a conversation starter. I don't claim to have reached definitive conclusions about all the problems in Catholic higher education or to have found a panacea to fix them all. I readily admit that my work is limited by my own perspective and social location as a Catholic, white, straight, cisgender male who's protected by what I call tenure track privilege and the unearned advantages that I have due to those other aspects of my identity. In addition, I readily acknowledge that I personally do not face the pressure to keep a Catholic college or university financially solvent, as President McGuire does, for example, a pressure that inevitably keeps many an administrator awake at night. I want to stress that my critiques of Catholic higher education are born of a love and gratitude for the many years that I've benefited from Catholic education, from grammar school all the way through doctoral studies. Moreover, I acknowledge that Catholic colleges and universities serve students and society in many laudable ways. However, like James L. Marsh, who spent 3 decades teaching philosophy at Catholic universities, and I quote, "I love these institutions as much or more for what they can be as for what they are," end quote. Given that there are more than 250 Catholic colleges and universities in the United States, and that the issues we're talking about are complex, I do not contend that I offer analysis of what happens on every campus. Rather, I point to problems that may not be universal, but are pervasive enough to warrant concern, and I point to promising practices where they exist. Now let me turn to my basic arguments. By virtue of their identity and mission, Catholic colleges and universities are obliged to teach the Catholic social tradition and discuss its vision for a more just, peaceful, and sustainable world. This obligation requires promoting justice both within the institution itself and more broadly in society. For as the 1971 Synod of Bishops stated, quote, "Anyone who ventures to speak to people about justice must first be just in their eyes," end quote. Many Catholic colleges and universities have developed strong efforts to promote justice in the world. However, I argue, confronting racism, white privilege, classism, economic injustices, and other inequities within our own hallowed halls has often not been as successful and is sometimes met with resistance. I argue that all stakeholders at Catholic institutions, that is, students, faculty, staff, administrators, and board members, must promote what the Nigerian Jesuit theologian Father Orobator calls domestic justice, or justice at home. Father Orobator exhorts the church to practice domestic justice within its own structures in order to be a credible advocate of the transformative vision of Catholic social teaching in the world. To put it in simple terms, on more than one occasion, students have expressed to me the belief that there is no point in learning Catholic social teaching if they're not seeing it practiced by their own Catholic institution. Thus, St. John Paul II was right to say, quote, "Today more than ever, the Church is aware that her social message will gain credibility more immediately from the witness of actions than as a result of its internal logic and consistency," end quote. Succinctly stated, Catholic universities must build solidarity with the oppressed and promote justice and liberation from every kind of oppression, those are Pope Benedict's words, both beyond and on their campuses in order to evangelize. Catholic institutions of higher learning have a clear mandate to do this. As the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has maintained, quote, "All the moral principles that govern the just operation of any economic endeavor apply to the church and its agencies and institutions. Indeed, the church should be exemplary," end quote. For example, the Catholic bishops have explicitly applied CST on labor to their guidelines for Catholic hospitals in the document Respecting the Just Rights of Workers. While not having the same regulatory force, the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities has formally recommended Catholic institutions, quote, continue to strive to incorporate CST into all aspects of their institutional life, end quote. The issue I'm considering has great pedagogical import, and hopefully you'll see some resonances here with what I'm about to say and the earlier panel from this morning. The aim of Catholic higher education is not simply to transmit knowledge, but to help shape the minds and hearts of our students so they can transform the world for the better. If teaching CST is to have this kind of transformative effect on our students, Catholic educators and institutions must move from talk to action. Modeling the ideals of the Catholic social tradition is even more important than teaching them in the classroom. In this connection, the logic of the market should not dominate Catholic higher education. If we demonstrate by our policy decisions and institutional arrangements that our values can be forsaken in the name of, quote, efficiency, fiscal responsibility, innovation, market competition, etc., we convey to our students that living out the gospel and Catholic social teaching simply costs too much, thereby affirming the nihilism and relativism already in the air in our society. In short, Catholic universities must expose their students to Catholic social teaching across the curriculum, not only in theology classes, advance justice and solidarity in the world, and embody CST intramurally in order to fulfill their role in the church's mission of evangelization. The first chapter of my book contains an exposition of Catholic social teaching's foundational principles, virtues, and values. The dignity of the human person, human rights and duties, the social nature of the human person, the common good and the public order, subsidiarity and socialization, solidarity, justice, the preferential option for the poor, and the right to participation. Incidentally, I note, going back to a comment by E.J. Dion this morning, I provide this overview in the book, knowing that most Catholics are not aware of Catholic social teaching. I argue nonetheless that these ideals can and must illuminate the path toward creating more just universities. However, I contend that the corporatization of higher education hinders Catholic institutions' ability to fulfill their mission, which includes creating an environment imbued with CST's respect for human rights, solidarity, justice, and the common good. The corporatization of the university has infected higher education with hyper-individualistic practices and models. In this paradigm, members of the university community, including entire programs or departments, who are perceived to be weaker are seen as drags on the system and should be marginalized or even eliminated. The corporatized university also reifies sharply hierarchical structures. These structures denigrate an important feature of the human person according to Catholic thought, namely her inclination to participate in the shaping of those structures that affect her life and those around her most significantly. To be a little more concrete, the corporatized university is, as Henry Steck puts it, quote, an institution that is characterized by processes, decisional criteria, expectations, organizational culture, and operating practices are taken from and have their origins in the modern business corporation. Steck goes on to say corporatized universities are, quote, characterized by the entry of the university into marketplace relationships and by the use of market strategies in university decision-making, end quote. I advance the thesis that there is a kind of culture clash in Catholic higher education between Catholic social teaching and the culture and ethos of the corporatized university, which is, of course, rooted in the broader culture and ethos of neoliberal capitalism. Unfortunately, students, faculty, and staff are harmed as a result of this culture clash. For example, models such as responsibility-centered management, or RCM, create, quote, powerful incentives to employ much cheaper labor. That's a quote from two former university administrators, i.e. employ adjunct faculty as the savings enabled academic units to generate more revenue from tuition. This has created a situation in which some administrators, athletics personnel, and full-time faculty make very handsome salaries, while adjuncts and graduate instructors live in or on the edge of poverty. I demonstrate that the principles of justice and solidarity pertaining to wages deems this situation and the market fundamentalism, a term I borrow from Stan Duncan and other scholars, used to justify it unacceptable. A lot more could be said about corporatization, of course. I'll just add something that echoes the thinking of others such as Sister Alice Galen, Father William Byron, and other giants of Catholic higher education. We still have not ensured that decision makers at Catholic institutions are well-versed in Catholic social, as well-versed in Catholic social teaching as they are in expertise from the corporate world and other fields. Following Father Byron, I suggest, among other things, mandatory mission and identity trainings for board members and all high-level administrators, and ideally, I would say, for all faculty and staff. Such training should be robustly rooted in Catholic social teaching. Let me just say something about a key methodological argument I make in the book. That is that too often Catholic universities tend to highlight their achievements on particular justice issues while overlooking others. For example, many Catholic institutions have made great strides in the area of environmental stewardship. However, some of the same institutions trample on the rights of workers on their campuses. Thus, I ask in the book if the 100 Catholic university presidents who signed a declaration to support the ecological vision of Pope Francis's Laudato Si in the summer of 2015 would sign a declaration on the rights of all workers on college campuses that would reflect Catholic social teaching on the right to unionize and to a living and just wage. What about a solemn pledge to enact the option for the poor in recruiting, admissions, financial aid, and retention policies? Would they sign a document that went beyond platitudes to promote the real inclusion and participation in authority structures of racial minorities, women, and LGBTQ persons on their campuses? The questions I raise are rooted in Catholic social teaching's insistence that we cannot simply pick and choose our favorite justice issues. In fact, the vision of integral ecology elaborated by Pope Francis holds that, quote, since everything is closely interrelated and today's problems call for a vision capable of taking into account every aspect of the global crisis, we must now consider some elements of an integral ecology, which clearly respects human and social dimensions. Succinctly stated, integral ecology demands that Catholic universities that rightfully commit themselves to sustainability and care of the environment must also earnestly pursue a, quote, social ecology of work, St. John Paul II's terminology, that respects the rights to a living wage and freedom of association, education that empowers the marginalized, and a milieu that fosters equity for the oppressed in society broadly and at universities in particular. In successive chapters of the book, I discuss worker justice on campus, recruiting, admission, and retention of economically disadvantaged students, socially responsible investment and financial stewardship, racial inclusion and justice, gender and LGBTQ equality. I do not have time here to rehearse the arguments and present the data from the book. Let it suffice here to say that the record of Catholic colleges and universities on these issues is mixed, with some embodying Catholic social teaching to a greater degree, while others struggle to resist the policies and practices of the neoliberal corporatized university. I show, for example, that Catholic colleges and universities generally employ adjunct faculty at the same rate as their secular counterparts. And in many cases, they're not paying them a living wage, and some cases, as Bill Herbert mentioned, stifle them from forming unions. Both of these practices blatantly contradict Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching has long championed the right to education of all people, including the poor. But unfortunately, recent trends in American higher education reveal what I call a preferential option for the rich at many institutions. And again, the record on this issue among Catholic colleges and universities is mixed, as I show in the book. Although much good work has been done on Catholic campuses to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, many colleges and Catholic colleges and universities replicate the interlocking patterns of race, wealth, and selectivity of the country's most selective universities. Minoritized students, particularly Blacks, Latinx, and Native Americans, remain underrepresented at many Catholic colleges and universities. There are, of course, exceptions. President McGuire's university is a shining example of what can be done and should be done. But I'm concerned about the places where minoritized students are still deeply underrepresented at our institutions. The Catholic call to solidarity requires dismantling the obstacles to enrolling and graduating minority students, especially from the most marginalized groups. While improvements have been made on some campuses towards equality and inclusion for LGBTQ people, Catholic colleges and universities exhibit significant differences on LGBTQ issues, and more can be done. For starters, Catholic institutions can and should credibly portray LGBTQ equity and inclusion in the language of Catholic social teaching, thereby showing that it is part of their mission. And finally, as I discussed in the chapter on investment and stewardship of resources, Catholic colleges and universities must apply the principles of Catholic moral theology to their investments, donations, large grants, and contracts. And here again, there's some overlap with the discussion that took place this morning. It is immoral, appropriation, or cooperation in evil, to use the technical terms of Catholic moral theology, to accept money or other goods that have been generated by exploitation of human beings. To do so is an affront to the dignity of the human person. To conclude, I know that I've left many questions unanswered and my thoughts here underdeveloped. That's quite intentional, actually. However, I want to stop in order to have time for ample conversation. Thank you for your patience in listening.
Great, thank you, Jerry. Pat, would you like to share your thoughts and experiences with everyone? We're eager to hear from you next.
Well, thank you so much, Heidi. And let me say at the outset that reading Jerry's book was not only a joy, it was so super educational for me. I wished I had had it 30 years ago when I started my job. I remember sitting next to a bishop at a meeting when I was a new president. And I said to the bishop, gosh, I wish there were some way for me to learn more about what I'm expected to do as a new president in a Catholic college. And he peered at me over his glasses very sternly and said, we expect our Catholic presidents to know what to do. And he was rather shocked that I didn't just have it all. But Jerry's right, there's a lot of education that needs to be done. And I want to reflect on a couple of historic trends that bring us to today, because I think Jerry's book and what he just said also magnifies and illuminates the fact that Catholic higher education has not yet come to grips with the many different historic influences that bring us to the current moment. And these are critical influences that have caused some of the things we're talking about. Catholic colleges were founded because of exclusion. We have to remember that. We were also at one time a minoritized population. And so we created our own schools because we couldn't go anywhere else. Also, footnote, Catholics believed co-education was sinful, you know, the old near occasion of sin the nuns talked about. So we were late to the co-education game, and we kept sex segregated schools for a long time. Now, not mentioned in Jerry's book, but I think central to the whole money issue is the fact that the financial structures of these institutions depended heavily on what we call euphemistically contributed services. I call it the free labor of women for the schools that were founded and built by religious orders of women and the men's orders too. The men and women worked for free. They borrowed from their congregations to buy the land and build the buildings. And when the religious labor disappeared, it was like the ebb tide going out, leaving these institutions high and dry. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the foundation in contributed services created a bizarre financial structure that many of us are still trying to recover from. The other part was about our students themselves. I mentioned we were historically excluded, and most of our students were white ethnic minorities who were also marginalized and impoverished. But because of the way Catholic parishes worked in our own communities, we didn't know how underprivileged we were in some sense. And our schools and then our colleges kept us in the same communities. Well, the GI Bill expanded educational opportunity. You know, this was the post-war era. Suddenly everything began to change. And in the post-war era, we saw Catholics suddenly entering the mainstream and realizing a world beyond their own parishes and communities. We also saw Catholic higher education in the 50s and the post-war era beginning to drive toward the idea of becoming normalized with other institutions of higher education and that competition. Now, I had a lot of personal experience with this as Trinity was going through changes. Some of the viewers may know Trinity was once a very elite white Catholic women's college, one of the first in the country. And today we are a predominantly Black institution and also a Hispanic serving institution with a student body that is 80% Pell grantees and median family income of just about $25,000. So that's been a big change. We call it the paradigm shift at Trinity. Well, early on in my presidency, I was quoted in the Washington Post about how St. Julie Billiart, the founder of the congregation that founded Trinity, the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, and I had studied Julie and the congregation to begin to understand what our roots were. And I gave an interview to the Post in which I said that, well, the Sisters of Notre Dame founded their schools and colleges to be of service to poor girls who were on the margins of society. Well, after that story appeared in the Washington Post, my phone rang off the hook. Fortunately, it was the days before email. It was just telephones then. But this one woman, one alumna was on the phone screaming at me saying, I was not poor, damn it. Why are you calling me poor? And that was part of the problem and still is part of our problem, I believe. I call it Catholics yearning to be Episcopalians. This idea that we grew up in neighborhoods where we always saw the rich people up the block who largely were not Catholic back in the day. And there was several generations of Catholics who didn't want to continue in their own communities and own lower class status. They wanted to become accepted in the way they saw the, dare I say, WASPs be accepted. And in fact, we were very successful, and Catholic higher education was part of the success of driving Catholics into the middle class and then the upper classes and into power structures that we enjoy today. Now, there were a couple of other things that happened that also continue to influence us today very much and explain some of why we lost the focus on Catholic social teaching, which the nuns had very much, and the religious orders. Well, Vatican II and the flight from religious labor was profound. And we haven't really come to grips with that yet, but the change, not only in presidencies, but the faculties and the entire warp and woof of the place, from the congregations to lay leadership, lay boards, very important. And we need to grapple with that a little more. The other thing that happened in the 60s, in particular 50s and 60s, was secular higher education, especially the publics, were beneficiaries of a great deal of defense funding and the space race. Well, Catholic colleges and universities did not share that largesse necessarily. It created economic imbalances just as we were going to laicizing faculty and needing more money. Even today, there is no great science or technology Catholic university, although many have the departments thereof, but that imbalance in funding has weighed on us very heavily. Now, after Vatican II and the space race, the third big force, which Jerry talks about in his book a lot, and I totally agree with, the rise of the NCAA and big time college sports in the 60s and 70s. This was a phenomenon that today drives so much of the wealth, so much of the prestige of these institutions everywhere. Would Georgetown be Georgetown today without that championship season? Would Villanova be Villanova today without all of those Final Four championships? We think of Gonzaga, think of BC without Doug Flutie. Suddenly, sports was propelling the national visibility of these institutions and making them appealing to students who were not particularly Catholic. The other thing that happened that is unresolved, Land O'Lakes. And that was 1967 when Father Hesburgh and those who gathered at Land O'Lakes, led by Notre Dame, declared the independence of our institutions from the hierarchy. The hierarchy certainly didn't like that and have spent largely the last 50 years trying to reel us back in. But the fact is, the laicization of boards, the Declaration of Independence drove us farther away from fully understanding some of the central issues that we're talking about today, particularly in Catholic social justice. The rise of the laicization of boards created a more corporate mindset. And today, now we have with the split, not only in the church, which the earlier panel today addressed so well, but we see all this also in the governance of institutions, Catholic institutions of higher education. The ideological and philosophical split in our church, in which some of our trustees, perhaps some faculty, perhaps some presidents, view Catholic social justice as a communist plot. It is not necessarily seen as something that we should be embracing, because through all of those years of change and tumult, we kind of lost hold of the central principles that had originally guided our congregations. I try to address all these issues at Trinity with our faculty, but these are big issues, and I think some of our associations, the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities and others, we try to deal with them, but I think still it's a very chaotic picture, and we are called to try to get a grip on it for the future of these institutions. So I'll stop there. There's a lot in that, but thank you for giving me the chance to lay that out.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And next up is Dr. Mary Antoinette Smith. We'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences.
Okay. When those of us on this panel met several weeks ago to coordinate our session, Professor Bayer made an earnest appeal for us to feel free to critique any parts of his book needing more work, revision, or additional content. I recall at the time wanting to say what I'll share now, which is this. In my view, his book is an exemplary text that is welcome and valued from my vantage point as a devout Catholic and faculty member of color who has been blessed with an academic career at a Jesuit institution espousing a social justice ethos aligned with the traditions of Catholic social teaching. Quite frankly, I love this book, and the reasons are many, including the fact that it offers a clear and concise overview of Catholic social teaching. It moves from theory to praxis by making a vigorous appeal for complete campus commitments to applying CST across our Catholic institutions of higher education. And I believe, along with Professor Bayer, that this should be done because, and this is a quote from his book, many of them have failed to embody the values of the gospel and the principles of Catholic social teaching in some important institutional policies and practices. And as a result, they have perpetuated injustices on their campuses. And although, as he points out, the church can neither force Catholic colleges and universities to teach the Catholic social tradition, nor mandate that their daily operations be guided by it, it is incumbent upon them to decide whether they want to attempt to remedy apparent and pervasive injustices, even if the economic, legal, and political context of US higher education places some constraints on them. In advocating for these measures, Bayer opens his book by admitting he did not relish writing it. And in doing so, he has risked arousing emotions and perhaps ire as it confronts the unjust racial, gender, and class-based structures that stifle the full flourishing of many colleagues and students. And as he points out, discussing racism, white privilege, classicism, homophobia, and economic injustices within the hallowed halls, not just out there in American society and the world more broadly, remains largely unwelcomed. In keeping with the labor themes of this conference, I wholly endorse his book and acknowledge the labor he underwent in producing such a courageous and comprehensive analysis. As Bayer points out, to his knowledge, no scholarly book has considered Catholic universities' policies and practices in the light of Catholic social teaching in a systematic way. Just Universities addresses this lacuna in ways that are informative, rich with candor, detailed with important quantitative data, and it is passionate in its earnest appeal for the incorporation and action of Catholic social teaching across our institutions of higher education. Upon completing the book, one is convinced that Professor Bayer has accomplished his aim of having written what he describes at the onset as a constructive work on Catholic social ethics, which utilizes data in order to examine the situation on Catholic campuses, to advance normative arguments about the need to pursue aspects of Catholic universities' mission with great zeal, and to propose ways to do so. He utilizes the method of Catholic social teaching identified as seeing, acting, judging. The three stages of which he points out were indicated by Pope John Paul XXIII to comprise first, identifying the situation, second, carefully examining the situation in relation to Catholic social teaching, and third, deciding what can and should be done in order that the traditional norms may be adapted to circumstances of time and place. As I read this, I thought, well, this sounds great in theory, but then queried, how does it play out in praxis in terms of Professor Bayer's charge that Catholic institutions of higher learning must demonstrate their willingness to implement the Church's social teaching? As he indicates throughout the book, some of our institutions do, some do not, and those that do so with varying degrees of commitment, consistency, and success. As a faculty member of color, nearing my 30th year career mark at a Jesuit institution, I think it is useful and informative to offer anecdotal reflections in answer to this praxis inquiry as follows. All aspects of my career aspirations converged into a natural fit when I arrived at Seattle University in 1994 as a newly hired tenure-track assistant professor in the English department. It was a time of fresh promise as I launched my career with the anomalous distinction of being an African-American teacher scholar with advanced degrees in 18th and 19th century British literature. As a recently professed member of the Dominican laity, I was eager to begin my professional life at our Catholic university. I had a vague vision at the time of what I hoped would materialize from my future as part of our campus community, but I had no notion of the sure fit that would fuse my vocational, academic, and avocational spiritual lives on campus. Seattle U invested much in my holistic formation as a teacher, scholar, and spiritually evolving person for others. And over the years, I became wholly enveloped in advancing our institutional commitment to celebrate educational excellence achieved through diversity and to foster a concern for justice and the competence to promote it. Again, it all sounds good in theory, and although I've had a less rocky path than most of my colleagues of color across our campus, the praxis piece has nevertheless been fraught with perpetual hard work, with the perpetual hard work of navigating myriad microaggressions while forging forth professionally despite the debilitating impact of racial battle fatigue Bayer describes in his book. My status as a Black faculty member has reflected over the years what Professor Bayer identifies as the dearth of diversity in terms of BIPOC faculty on Catholic campuses of higher education. And it has necessitated the indefatigable labor of pursuing a professional career of pioneering firsts. These include being the first and only tenure-track African-American professor in my department until this current academic year, being the first African-American to earn tenure in the year 2000 in the College of Arts and Sciences, and the second in the history of the university, which was established in 1891. Being the first and only African-American professor many of my students would have while earning their undergraduate degrees. Being the first and only African-American in my literary area of expertise until recently. And as of last month, being one of the two first and only African-Americans promoted to the rank of full professor in the history of our College of Arts and Sciences. I learned of my promotion the same week I was invited to serve on this panel. And I wish I had had Bayer's book on hand when preparing my file for the statistical data he includes. This revelatory data documents the meager numbers of Black tenure-track faculty across our higher ed campuses. This reality was bittersweet in view of my recent advancement in rank, as it further illuminated for me the paradoxically raw yet rewarding reality of my positionality as a rare and anomalous African-American faculty member at the highest and loneliest rank of my career. It's not lost on me that the labor endured in accomplishing my upward mobility in the academy pairs with the accomplishment of Professor Bayer producing his book. Both of our feats have required courage and candor, which are critical in what he posits as an initial step, a conversation starter for a much needed discussion regarding the challenging, unjust, inequitable, dehumanizing, and unfair practices affecting intersectionally marginalized faculty, staff, and students across our campuses. In his chapter titled Racial Inclusion and Justice at Catholic Colleges and Universities, From Tokenism to Participation, he opens with mention of an African-American spiritual known as Plenty Good Broom, and acknowledges the plain fact that even if there is plenty good room for people of color at our universities, There really isn't room at the table for them because the vast majority of important decisions are made by white administrators and white board members, while precious few people of color hold positions of power in our universities. Although he states the obvious, Professor Bayer proves himself to be a credible, trusted, intentional colleague and ally. And I'm convinced he is wholly dedicated to reversing the exclusionary practices plaguing persons of color in Catholic higher education. His recommendations for the incorporation of Catholic social teaching across our campuses trends toward the promotion and realization of equity, justice, and inclusion of a critical mass of BIPOC persons in top-tier administrative positions, in addition to having us as well-represented non-tokenized faculty of color across the academic disciplines at our Catholic colleges and universities. Until our campuses reflect a fully inclusionary range of BIPOC faculty, staff, and students who are thoroughly integrated, fully comfortable, and wholly welcome, we will, as Professor Bayer notes, continue to be out of step with Catholic social teachings. As I often share with my students as part of the pedagogical ambiance of my classrooms, in African-American culture, we have a concept known as the welcome table, to which all are eagerly invited. It is a nourishing and sustaining table which feeds the body, the mind, and the soul. And it is well reflected in my institution's Ignatian principle of cura personalis, meaning care for the whole person, a concept which for me expands to include self-care, community care, and global care. This principle has deeply impacted my personal and professional lives throughout my 27 years at Seattle U, and it has both motivated and sustained me in terms of staying the course as a Black faculty member at my institution and in the profession at large. It has also informed my contemplation of self-care in view of my having entered my 6th decade 4 years ago, wherein I began considering my future retirement. I had become uncertain about having the emotional, psychological, physical, intellectual, pedagogical, and scholarly bandwidth to continue having to achieve at the necessitated momentum required of me as an academician of color. Throughout my career, I have never mastered my ideal of an even balance between my teaching, scholarship, and service responsibilities, because, as is well known, there occurs an imbalanced trifurcation for faculty of color, wherein we are ever called upon to engage in exhaustive, uncompensated, non-visible, and unacknowledged service activities, which typically obstruct us from pursuing the other aspects of our professional lives, which matter equally as much to us and are of critical importance in advancing our careers. As a career-weary faculty member of color, I saw retirement as a life and dignity-saving requisite, until I realized, in keeping with the seeing, acting, judging specifications of Catholic social teaching, that it was incumbent upon me before retiring to apply for promotion to full professor in order to either successfully break through the glass ceiling for up-and-coming faculty of color, particularly Black faculty, or risk being denied promotion despite a proven record of distinguished accomplishment in order to ferret out inherent and explicit racial bias at my home institution. In preparing my file statements, I referenced the paucity of BIPOC colleagues among TT faculty, while pointing out the numbers grew grimmer the higher one looked along the assistant, associate, and full professor rankings. Happily, my petition for promotion was successful. Yet, while feeling affirmed by this hard-won achievement, I remain saddened by the lone nature of my stature as one of a shamefully infinitesimally small number of African Americans holding the rank of full professor at Seattle University, as well as across our Catholic and secular colleges and universities in this country. This being said, within the context of the general dearth of Black faculty at the lower ranks of the professoriate, I've made the discerned choice not to retire in the near future. Instead, I plan to stay the course indefinitely in order to be a proactive participant in the worker justice Professor Bayer speaks of in his book. I still have much to offer as an active contributor to the important work that awaits our dedicated labor in achieving racial and intersectional equity and inclusion at Seattle U and across our Catholic colleges and universities. There is much repair and reversal work to be done because, as Professor Bayer observes, our campus cultures have failed to reflect the concerns for the dignity of human persons and their well-being and the dignity of work so powerfully expounded in the Catholic social tradition. The grind of working in a corporatized university stifles human flourishing in myriad ways, including the mental and spiritual health of students, along with the deleterious effects of university life on the well-being of faculty, administrators, and staff in general, not to mention the impact of these realities specifically on BIPOC members of our campus communities. In closing, I offer my profound thanks to Professor Bayer for producing Just Universities. I commend him for laboring through the research, writing, real commitment to, and recommendations for vitalizing and incorporating the mandates of Catholic social teaching in our endeavors to ensure and enact equity, inclusion, racial, and intersectional justice across our campuses. While it may be a book he did not relish writing, sorry, I lost my place. While it may be a book that he did not relish writing, it is one I revere, personally and professionally. I value it especially because of the deep labor he invested in researching it and writing it from his purview and positionality as a committed, credible, worthy of trust, white male ally and advocate, infused with the spirit of worker justice that is so needful as our cadre of serious advocates dedicatedly mobilize in solidarity to enact Catholic social action on behalf of disadvantaged and marginalized BIPOC faculty, staff, and students across our campuses. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those thoughts. Lily, we'd like to hear from you next. I just want to make one quick reminder to everyone in the audience. Please do put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. After Lily speaks, we'll have the panelists chat a little bit amongst themselves, but we're going to be turning to your questions in a little bit. So we'd like to have you place them in the Q&A if you would. That would be great. Lily, please take the floor.
Thanks so much. So I'm really grateful to hear from everyone who's already spoken. I feel like there's a lot to think about, so I want to keep it brief because I want to make sure we can have some time to discuss things as well. I want to echo my thanks to Jerry for writing this book. I think reading it was really affirming in some ways, and I think I can sympathize kind of with what others have been saying and what is in the introduction of the book, that it's difficult to write things and it's difficult to criticize Catholic universities when you're part of them, because I think, I really care about Catholic higher education. I really care about the value of a Catholic education. But I think in some ways it almost makes it that much worse when it lets you down. When an institution, when a Catholic institution doesn't live up to its values, it almost hurts that much more, because you know what it could and what it should be. And so from my own story, I grew up very Catholic. I went to Catholic schools. And so when I chose to go to Georgetown, I was making a choice to go to a Catholic institution because that was something that I really wanted to go to, an institution that had these values. And I grew up in the South. I went to a Catholic school in Louisiana that was not particularly forward with Catholic social teaching and progressive values. And so going to Georgetown, I thought, here it is, here's my chance. And so I remember actually as a student in high school reading the mission statement of Georgetown, and just looking at it now, it has multiple references to the common good, to an education that promotes the glory of God and the well-being of all humankind, and invites people to be active participants in civic life and to live generously in the service of others. Just paraphrasing, there's more to it. But I was so excited by that. Oh, here it is. Here's an opportunity to go to a university that lives up to these values. And to Georgetown's credit, largely they do. But what I didn't know when I arrived at Georgetown is that there was this long history of student activism that was really holding Georgetown to those values. That it didn't just happen, automatically. That the labor justice, environmental justice, racial justice work didn't just happen because the university said that these are part of its values. It really was part of a longer struggle from students, from faculty, from staff, from workers, and from the community to make sure that these values were held up as a standard. And so I think it's a really interesting, the book is a really interesting opportunity to think about what these institutions can be. And I think as a student, I got very involved in activism because I was interested in what those values could be. So when I first arrived at Georgetown, I immediately became involved in an organization called the Georgetown Solidarity Committee. And the goal of that committee was to reach out to and work with campus workers to hear about their stories and to work with them and their unions to advance labor justice issues on campus. And so very quickly, I was involved in campaigns around unionization, campaigns around wages. And it was through that I sort of got to see what Jerry describes in the book about how universities are often run like businesses. And there's a great chart in there in the section about sports, and it talks about the salaries of different people at universities. And it's a really shocking chart to see just how much the basketball coaches are making, the football coaches are making, how much the presidents are making, CIOs, and in many ways it really is run like a business. And so early in my student activism, one of the first things we talked about was how much are our administrators making, and as we got further along, we would look into who's on our board of directors, because surely if we're this institution that's promoting social justice, surely our board of directors who's making the decisions and the financial decisions that are driving this university, surely that will reflect it. And I think in the book, it discusses this, that, as time has gone on, the boards of universities often don't reflect the mission of the university. They're often primarily financial folks in the finance industry, the banking industry, the tech industry, law, private equity. And so I think as a student activist, that was really troubling, that the folks who would be making decisions about the issues that we really cared about were not necessarily folks who came from the backgrounds that we would hope would be able to represent the university's values fairly. And so I think, increasingly, as folks, I'm no longer a student, I graduated several years ago, but the students that I work with now in my role at Georgetown are really energized to talk about social justice, are really energized to talk about racial justice, and are really energized to talk about labor justice. Younger people are more likely to be interested in labor unions, are more likely to support labor unions. They're more likely to support the movement for racial justice. They're more likely to identify as LGBTQ and also to support LGBTQ issues. And so when we look to our universities, including Catholic institutions, we expect them to follow suit or to listen to us when we say these are the issues and the values that we care about. And I think sometimes universities respond really well. And at Georgetown, we have an LGBTQ resource center. We've had one for years. There were efforts, at least, to listen to students during this past summer's Black Lives Matter movement, but also when I was a student in 2014, with the first round of Black Lives Matter protests, there certainly was an effort to really make moves around that. But at Georgetown and at other universities, that once the student activism dies out, once our foot is off the gas, it felt like is this still good? Is this still something that's relevant to universities? Are they paying lip service to us at times when it's convenient, or is this something that is an enduring value of the university? So, as some examples of campaigns that I was involved with when I was a student, there was, early on and before I had really become aware of what was going on campus, there was a sit-in outside of our president's office about 2 dorms on campus, and they were both named for Jesuits who in the 1800s were involved in the sale of 272 Black slaves, who they used that money to pay off the university's debts. And some students, with the help of faculty, with the help of others, and there was a project to reach out to descendants of those 272 people, they said, why do we have 2 dorms on campus named after these 2 people? And pretty quickly, Georgetown sort of took up the mantle and said, this is a problem, we're going to change the names. But it happened because of student pressure, and it happened because students reached out to descendants and they said, this is a problem that we want to address. And pretty quickly, it was dealt with because students asserted their power and they said, this is something we really care about. At another point in time, I was working with adjunct faculty at our university, and we were working with their union, we were working with the adjuncts themselves to fight for a fair contract. And adjunct faculty are, as we know, one of the more have a labor situation on campuses that's really challenging. And at Georgetown, they were really lucky to have a union, but that didn't. And when we were in negotiations with the university, it felt like this is something that's a given, that the university is, we have a union, so what more could you want? And it felt like they had forgotten what had happened in order to get there. And so being a student activist in that case was just a constant battle to be able to tell the university that we don't want one thing, you have to keep going, you can't just let up after one or two wins. It's a constant battle. And so I think, the last thing I'll say that is, after I graduated, I was really lucky to be able to come back to Georgetown to work at the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. And it's a labor center at Georgetown that was created largely in response to ongoing student activism and ongoing pressure from workers and students on campus. And was also created as part of a larger initiative at Georgetown called the Just Employment Policy. The Just Employment Policy emerged after a fairly dramatic wave of student activism in 2005, when about, I think it was 18 students, but I think it's in the book, went on strike for 8 days, on hunger strike for 8 days to fight for a living wage for all campus workers. So a living wage being the floor for all workers on Georgetown's campus. And to Georgetown's credit, after that strike, I think they really decided that this is something that we really want to enshrine as part of the university's values. And so the Just Employment Policy was created to really put pen to paper to say that, we're not just going to say we care about labor rights, but we're going to make this part of every worker's experience at Georgetown, that a living wage is the standard floor for wages at Georgetown. That Georgetown will support the right of workers to unionize, and a variety of other pieces in there. And so the Kalmanovitz Initiative has been a part of sort of promoting the Just Employment Policy to other Catholic and Jesuit universities. And so, that's one way that students were able to get involved to making a real and tangible change. But, the role of students on campuses continues even with the Just Employment Policy, because it's a document that only lives and works if students are able to enforce it and hold the university accountable to that. And so other students at other universities have looked to the Just Employment Policy as a way to fight for meaningful change on their own campuses with their own workers. It's interesting to think about what other places and what other types of things could be included for issues that are included in the book, like environmental justice or emissions policies, investments. Universities are so broad and are in many ways their own ecosystems of relationships and finances. And so being able to have policies that are progressive really can impact so many people in so many different ways. And having the student voice involved in that is really important.
Great. Thank you so much, Lily. Your thoughts inspired me in so many ways, one of which is the sense of hope from the younger generation. Thinking back to E.J. Dionne said in the earlier panel, he was kind of worried that maybe there wasn't that commitment to Catholic social teaching among younger Catholics. And I think you're proving him wrong, which is wonderful to hear. I thought maybe, Jerry, I wanted to maybe throw a few thoughts out for you to take up if you choose, or you can go in whatever direction you choose, but to connect with what Pat and Mary Antoinette and Lily just said, and get you all talking together for a few minutes, and then we'll open up some of the questions in the Q&A. I'd be curious to hear your response to Pat's reflection on the historic trends, which I'm very much interested in as a historian. I think that's really interesting how she brings in some of those pieces to contextualize a lot of your conversation. And then your thoughts on Mary Antoinette's reaction to your work and her lived experience. And then what Lily just was sharing with us, which was mostly hopeful, but I think also what she said about, the sense of betrayal when the institutions don't live up to the teachings, that's really felt by the students. However you want to slice and dice that, I'm going to just toss that back to you, and then have the panelists feel free to kind of jump into the conversation.
Thank you, Donna, and thanks to Pat and Dr. Smith and Lily. I'm deeply honored and moved. I couldn't imagine a better panel. You're kind of, like I said, an all-star panel, and I'm humbled to have listened to your thoughts. I'll just go in the order that the presentation of the presentations. So starting with President McGuire, absolutely. In fact, one of the reviewers of the book, the pre-publication reviewers, asked me to do a little bit more on the history. So I did a little bit more, but I was already over the word limit. And so you're providing really important context for what I'm trying to get at, the issues I'm trying to get at. There's no question that the trends that you pointed to, the laicization, the end of religious free labor, essentially, to a large degree, is significant here. One question, though, that I have about that is, and one issue I point to repeatedly in the book, dismayingly so, why is it that secular universities have, not all, but some, have been able to do better than Catholic universities? To tie in with Dr. Smith's, which again, I was so moved by your talking of your firsts, you're speaking of your firsts. Why is it that at secular universities, I talk about this in the book, right? We talk, one of you, actually it was you, President McGuire, women started at Catholic universities almost 100 years later than at other institutions. Why is that? Why is it that at Catholic institutions, it took longer for Blacks to be admitted than at other secular schools? I trace a little bit of that history. One piece of the history I don't mention that I leave out, and I'm going to admit I'm indebted to a graduate student who brought this to my attention. I'm constantly learning more. I need to learn more. What about the history of taking land from Native peoples? I just encountered an article called Land Grabbing Universities the other day. Now that's an article about land trust universities, public institutions, but we could also raise this question, should also raise this question about our Catholic institutions. Whose land was stolen to find? So there's absolutely a lot of history that needs to be unearthed and addressed. And I certainly didn't do all that in the book. And Dr. Smith, again, I was moved by your remarks, deeply grateful, humbled. You're speaking about your first. I can only say kudos to you for persevering through what inevitably, must have been a lot of trials in achieving the heights that you have achieved as a full professor. Again, what about secular schools? Why is it that at secular schools, in a lot of cases, the first Black student in a secular school was much earlier than at a Notre Dame or at a Georgetown or what have you? Why? What is that? And then when we talk about how to change our institutions so that there are more BIPOC students, faculty, and as you rightly point out, administrators at the highest levels, it has to be the case. I mentioned in the book, just to complicate the picture a little bit more, we're talking a lot about wanting to, address the so-called pipeline problem, that we need more people, BIPOC people coming through the pipeline, earning doctorates. The numbers I cite are, just shocking, that how few BIPOC people are earning doctorates in the United States these days. But then I point out, I think it's unjust to ask young people of color to do a doctorate knowing that they may have to take up a position at a university where they will be earning poverty wages. Because as we know, full-time and tenure track positions at many of our institutions are waning. And so that's the thread that I tried to run through the entire book, is the corporatization piece. If we want to talk about DEI at our universities, we have to also address this corporatization piece. Lily, thanks so much for your reflections. I am in awe of students like you that just do the hard work and try to harness the power in the ways that you have. I was honored to meet some Georgetown students who engaged in that hunger strike that you mentioned and that I discussed in the book. The question I want to raise, so I applaud you for talking about student power. It's really important. We should never forget that students do hold power and that they are our future hope. I just want to end, I'm going to end right now with this question. Why did it take a hunger strike? Why should it take a hunger strike to implement a just employment policy on any of our campuses?
Any of the panelists want to jump in on that? Provocative, yes, Pat.
I'm going to let Lily answer why it took a hunger strike, but Lily, great work on your part, and Dr. Smith also, your words were very moving. I'm going to go back to the question, very provocative, that Jerry posed, which is why did it take us so long? And frankly, we're not there yet. It's still taking us a long time. There's a couple of issues that are taking us so long. And I'm going to say my own provocative piece here. I think Ex Corde Ecclesiae set back the course of history a lot because Ex Corde was the Vatican's response to Land O'Lakes, let's face it. And in trying to reel us back in, the conversation turned away from the ideals of our mission and the charism of our orders, and it focused on legalistic, doctrinal issues around the mandatum and around other things. And yes, Ex Corde, and you quote in your book, Ex Corde has a lot of great language. Actually, some of us recognize that the JP2 document was fine, but once it became about norms and the local bishops and the authority, this whole thing became part of the culture wars. And in the culture wars, why it took Catholic higher ed so long, among other things, because we've been embroiled in our own internal culture war between those of us who think that Catholic social justice should be the central animating force of our institutions, and those who believe that the litmus test is whether we have LGBTQ students banned from campus, the culture wars. So many of those who want to tell us what to do, and I think of the Cardinal Newman Society writ large, but it doesn't take the Cardinal Newman Society to do this. It takes a board member or a faculty member or a more conservative student group to do this, terrorizing us about speakers, about fidelity to church doctrine and so forth. And I've been to years of meetings of the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities. We've never talked about how do we do transformative work in admissions to make our institutions more welcoming of students of color and low-income students and faculty of color. We've never had that kind of discussion, to my knowledge, that's been central on the agenda. The agenda has always been about, oh my God, how are we going to keep the bishops out of our hair? And we are constantly struggling about governance and jurisdiction rather than about mission and meeting. So that's one thing. The other piece, just real quickly, in the mind of trustees, alums, and perhaps some presidents, there's a great deal of confusion about what it means to be Catholic. And I put this in the context of as when Trinity was going through this tremendous paradigm shift from being predominantly white to predominantly Black, our alumni were in a great uproar. It's well documented. You can read about that. And in one of the great alumni meetings we had where everybody was yelling at me, somebody stood up and said, well, we don't mind diversity, but are they Catholic? And there's this idea that we can only educate Catholics. We should only be about Catholics. And of course, you know, whether it was John Carr or Cardinal Hickey or any one of the people who had the great phrase, we do this not because they're Catholic, but because we're Catholic. Well, that had not gotten through to many of the lay people who are now making the decisions. So my comment earlier about laicization of boards and presidencies, it didn't take us in a more progressive direction necessarily. It actually took us into a more parochial direction because the lay people are afraid of doing something wrong in the eyes of the bishops. And so rather than being enlightened and progressive, we've become more conservative. And that's one of the answers, I think, to why it's taken us so long.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's really, really interesting to put the pieces together. I want to give Lily and Dr. Smith a minute if they want to jump in on any of those points. But we've got about 15 minutes left, and I do want to turn to the Q&A from the audience. But I don't know, Dr. Smith or Lily, did you want to jump in, connect up to any of those thoughts at this point? You can just unmute and jump in, Dr. Smith. Yeah, please do.
So Jerry, when you mentioned the fact that our secular institutions seem to be doing better than we as Catholic institutions in terms of social justice and advocacies and equity issues. I just, you know, just as a tangentially related to that, Seattle University, obviously we're Catholic, and we recruit at freshman year. So we bring freshmen in as first year students. And I've been at Seattle U almost 30 years. And over my years, what I've discovered is my most mission-driven students that come into my classroom tend to be the transfer students from our community colleges. And they have not been shaped or formed by our Jesuit mission-oriented ethos from freshman year. They come in as juniors and sometimes seniors, and they're raring to go. Like I just find that really, really interesting that there's something going on out in the world that we want to happen on our campuses in alignment with Catholic social teaching and social justice issues. But it's actually happening to greater degrees out there in the world, more so than on our campuses. And so that's what I thought of when you brought that up. And I don't know how to address that. I just have sort of in the field experience with that. And I don't have any answers. I'm looking forward to working with you to just sort of brainstorm and work towards some things. You all have really inspired me. And Lily, thank you for helping to continue to restore my faith in the future and where we can all go together in the future. And Pat, you're so incredibly knowledgeable. And I still want to come and visit you on your campus.
Come.
If I may invite myself.
Of course.
I do see we have some questions. Maybe Lily, you can jump in. I think one of the questions on deck you can speak to. So I'm going to have Mac come in and field. We've got a question in the Q&A, and I think he's got one from Bill as well. I'm going to have Mac read those, direct those.
Yep. Hello, everybody. Thanks. The first question is from Isaac Gottsman. He first thanks you for this wonderful conversation, and he says he's wondering if any of you have any thoughts about unionization of staff who are even lower paid than faculty and have even less power. Notably, at my institution and at many others, many of the staff ranging from administrative staff to custodial staff to groundskeepers and residents and dining hall staff are people of color. Thus, while the faculty and administration are very white, as Dr. Smith's own experience reflects, the reverse is true with staff. So this is more a statement to respond to if any of the panelists would like to, than a question.
I'm wondering if maybe Lily, can you speak to that? Because I know you did a lot of organizing out on campus.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And I think maybe this kind of ties into the question about why did it take a hunger strike? And to be clear, I was not there for that. I was in 2005. And to give Georgetown a lot of credit, they were on top of it, kind of at the forefront of a living wage for campus workers who were primarily Black and Brown people, while the student body and the faculty were primarily white. And so it was a really important thing. And I think to lift up some of the challenges that are going on at campuses, Catholic campuses across the country, I know at a number of universities with academic faculty, like at Marquette and at John Carroll, there are problems with tenured and non-tenured faculty. But at other universities, there's a huge question about non-faculty staff. So staff, and both administrative staff and custodial, food service, groundskeeping staff, and whether or not they can join unions. And I think one of the reasons why I think such intense student activism has been effective and is occasionally needed is because I think these universities, Catholic universities, often want to be all things to all people. They want to both be, elite and effective academic institutions of higher education, modeling after secular institutions. They want to be, some of them want to be athletic powerhouses. They want to have, $50 million gyms that will appeal to the best basketball recruits. But they also sort of want to be like financial institutions and businesses. They have multi-million-dollar endowments. And so when they see groups of workers unionizing, that's a threat to their bottom line. And there have been a couple of examples, and many of them have involved academic unions of Catholic universities saying, well, because we're Catholic, we don't have to recognize unions, or, kind of saying that the NLR, the National Labor Relations Act, doesn't apply to us because we're Catholic, which is really kind of a shocking statement when you think about it. And a lot of that has been applied to academic workers, but I think it applies to food service, to custodial, to janitorial workers as well, and sometimes even more so. A lot of the times universities will subcontract those workers, so they have even less rights, and it's even more difficult to unionize. And I think while universities would say that these are workers that are part of our community that are really important, I don't know that we always see that reflected. And I think it's easier for universities to sort of invisibilize, I'm not sure if that's a word, but sort of anonymize that group of workers because it's going to be easier for their bottom line. And so I think, the role of students, of faculty, of staff who do have power, who do have unions, who do have tenure, is to call that out when we see it and say, these members of our community are really valuable. And as a Catholic institution, we have to be looking out for them and making sure that everyone is made whole on our campuses.
Mhm.
Can I say a quick word there?
Yeah.
Two things. Heidi Schlumpf talked about this in the first panel. There's a lot of not only ignorance of Catholic social teaching, but hostility towards the right to unionize in Catholic social teaching. The data shows that a lot of Catholics are anti-union, and there's no reason to believe that anti-union sentiment does not exist on our campuses among leaders. Having said that, what I found in my research is that there's more resistance to faculty unionization than the unionization of other staff members at Catholic universities. If you look at the Catholic Labor Network's website, you can see they try to track where unions exist on Catholic campuses. And there are many more unions among other types of staff than faculty unions. What I speculate in the book is that universities who are engaging in union busting believe that if the faculty unionizes, it's going to cost them a lot more than if a group of staff in another sector unionize. In addition, if faculty unionize, they're going to want to have much more of a stake in shared governance, which is something that a lot of universities unfortunately do not really want.
Mhm. That's true. I'm just going to say two footnotes here. One, my own position is that I think it's scandalous that certain Catholic universities actively oppose unions, and they should not. And when bishops are quick to make statements if I have a speaker on campus they don't like, but why aren't they speaking out against the anti-union predilection of certain institutions? And I won't name them, but you know who they are. The second thing I'll just say from my own experience. The real issue here, unionization is important, but the care of the person. The care for every person on campus is my motivating force as an employer. And some of our outsourced staff through Aramark or Allied Barton, they're unionized, and we respect that. Our adjuncts are. Our support staff are not, but we take care of them. So for example, during the pandemic, we didn't lay anybody off. We didn't cut back benefits, and I was shocked at how many institutions first went to laying off and cutting back their least well-paid workers. In fact, we gave small raises to our least well-paid workers to help them through the pandemic because we knew they were struggling. I'm not saying me, we're great, because I wanted to do more. But to me, the main question is whether leadership understands that their first and foremost duty is to care for every person on campus, students, faculty, staff. It's the quality of care and the sense of human community we create that is our Catholic sensibility. And the fact that people have to unionize suggests already that there's something wrong because they're feeling they're not being well cared for. And, certainly respect the union. And it's sad that this is even an issue in Catholic colleges.
Okay, Mac, do we have time for another question or two, I think? Yeah.
Sure, yeah, I'll move on to another question. This one from an anonymous questioner. The question is labor history taught in Catholic institutions, particularly the historic role of Catholic support for the labor movement? That's for anyone who would like to answer.
It's not. So I belong to a group called Catholic Scholars for Worker Justice, and some of my mentors in that group who have been in the academy much longer could talk for hours about the elimination of labor studies at Catholic universities. It's a really sad tale to know that labor studies has been eliminated at many Catholic institutions, not all, but many. I learned that labor law is not taught at many Catholic law schools. And there's a long history to that, but a convoluted history to that, in my opinion. But nonetheless, the bottom line from where I sit is that the crucial teachings on the rights, dignity, and rights of workers is not being taught across many of our campuses at all.
Anybody else care to chime in on that one?
The only exception I think of is Joe McCartan at Georgetown. Right? We know he's teaching it, but
yeah. But I'll just say I think it would be an interesting topic for some researchers to undertake, and perhaps some student classes in our. We teach some of this in sociology and in business, but the retreat from unions among Catholics, along with the move to affiliation with the Republican Party and the entire political change in the Catholic base, because certainly at one time we were all very, very pro-union, but that was when we were all very, very democratic and mostly blue collar. So the economic change and the political change go hand in hand with this.
Right, that was something that was talked about on the first panel this morning. Before, if maybe there's no time for another question, but I just want to say before we run out of time that I'm so grateful to all of you panelists, because in fact, each one of you in your respective positions at your universities have demonstrated across your careers and in your various positions that this can be done. I mean, you President McGuire, have been a prophetic leader of a Catholic university, showing that this can be done against the grain, as you talked about. Dr. Smith, you obviously, as you said, had a long and arduous journey to get where you are, and it will continue to be difficult for BIPOC faculty, students, and staff, but it can be done. And Lily, you and your colleagues who organized at Georgetown as student activists also showed that it can be done. It's not easy. But for those who say this is just not feasible, we have to go with the larger trends in higher education. I'm just so inspired by all three of you because of what you've been able to do.
Thank you. That's very generous of you to say. I will say as a footnote, there's still people who want my head on a platter. So there you go.
That shows you're doing the right thing.
That's right.
And that's also very Catholic, right?
Very Catholic.
So any
Close
final
to the end of
thoughts?
our time.
One more question, Mac? Do we have time? Yeah.
Sure. If the panelists don't mind, we're close to the end, but I'll put this final question to the group, and it's a little bit touching on a subject that's been addressed already, but Kathleen Cook thanks you for the terrific panel and the book. And she says, as part of an institution that is run by a corporate board and high paid outsiders, what can those who are not in positions of leadership do to prompt a return to what we say we're about?
It's a big question. I don't know who wants, maybe who wants to take that one? Go back to Jerry.
It is a big question. I think, first of all, we have to have more honest and transparent conversations on our campuses. Again, I'm not trying to portray what goes on every campus. I don't know that. But from what I understand, on a lot of Catholic campuses, these conversations are just not happening. And so we have to have these open, transparent conversations about how the university is being run according to what values and how they may or may not comport with the values of Catholic social teaching. I've been really gratified to learn that on a couple Catholic campuses, there are some book discussion groups going on using this book. I'm not saying that this book has to be the conversation starter, but to have these conversations. And one thing I learned from another colleague, a mentor of mine, James Keenan, the Jesuit theologian, we need to build relationships of trust first. I'm a very impetuous person. I want to get right to the justice issues, right? Let's talk about the rights of workers. Let's talk about how faculty of color are being discriminated against. And we have to talk about it, but we also have to work at building relationships of trust across the various divisions that exist on our campuses.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we're right at time here. I wanted to thank everyone on the panel. It was a really wonderful discussion, really fruitful, and I can see in the Q&A, the audience really enjoyed it very much. I just want to make one quick announcement before we all go. For those of you who are attending and other panelists, if you're interested, there's another panel at 2 o'clock on principles and practices for effective negotiations. To access that, go back to the conference landing page and you can access the link for that. That starts at 2 o'clock. So thank you all so much. This was a wonderful panel. Please do, if you have the time this afternoon, jump on that 2 o'clock panel. And again, you go to the conference landing page to access that. So thanks so much, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks so much to all the panelists.
Thank you all.